Anybody in the room, there are microphones on the ceiling, so if anybody wants to ask a question at any point, you will be heard. Welcome to this session. What if we let people decide? A debate on breadth and depth of cash assistance in protracted settings. My name is Hannah Miles, and I'm a research manager at Ground Truth Solutions, working on our Cash Barometer project. I'm really excited to welcome you to the session today, and also a big welcome to our panelists today. So maybe I will ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves. So maybe starting with Liam.
Morning, everyone. My name is Liam Kelly. I'm with DG ECHO, so the EU's Humanitarian Office, focused on Somalia and Horn of Africa.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andres Parrado. I'm a senior research manager at GiveDirectly. We're an NGO that provides unconditional cash transfers, and I focus mostly on monitoring and evaluation, particularly in East Africa.
Great. And then let's go over to Francesca Sangioggi online.
Hi, morning, everyone. I'm Francesca, and I'm the program coordinator for the Somali Cash Consortium.
And then we have another Francesca for good measure, Francesca Di Celia from as well online.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Francesca Di Celia. I'm the chief for the World Food Program for cash-based transfers, policy and design. I am based in Rome, so global coverage, and I've been with WFP for 20 years. I'm very happy to be here today and in this interesting debate. Over.
Great. And then finally, we have a colleague of mine, Heba, also online.
Hi, everyone. My name is Heba Ibrahim, and I work as an analyst for Ground Truth Solutions on the Cash Barometer project in Somalia.
Great. Today we're going to discuss broadly different approaches to delivering cash and voucher assistance in protracted settings. And I think, first I want to ask, why is it important that we think at all about doing things differently in this area? We know that funding gaps are widening as funding stagnates in many responses, and alongside that you see people, the number of people in need growing more and more. In 2021, there was an estimated 74% of people in need who were living in protracted crises. So protracted crises are now very much the norm in humanitarian assistance. And so in these situations where there's little sign of an end to a crisis and funding is not able to keep up with growing needs, we're going to have to be a bit creative about how cash is delivered in order to maximize impact. So this might mean, for example, broadening CVA, allowing CVA to meet more people in a community, and for that transfer values to be decreased. It might also mean making CVA deeper, so reaching potentially a smaller number of people with more cash in order to maintain spending power. And so these two different options are what we're going to discuss today. And just so that you all have an idea of how this session is going to go, I'm going to give a small overview of the data that Ground Truth Solutions has been collecting in this area. Then I'm going to hand over to our panelists, who are also going to talk briefly about their work on this, about why this topic is interesting for them. And then we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion, and I'm very happy for anybody to ask questions at any point. We will have a set amount of time at the end for questions, but I think, if somebody has a burning question at any point in the room or online, please just raise your hands and we'll try and get to it. So be nice if we can make this as interactive as possible. So before then, I'd like to set the scene by looking at the data from the Cash Barometer. So what is the Cash Barometer, first of all? We're an independent accountability mechanism, and this project is in 3 countries so far, in Somalia, in the Central African Republic, and Nigeria. And it's a people-centered project, like much of what we do at Ground Truth Solutions. We focus on putting people at the center of humanitarian assistance and bringing their perceptions, their ideas, their recommendations into decision-making in many different fora. So the research we do on the cash barometer as well is all perceptions based. So we ask people about how they feel about the assistance they receive, how it supports their resilience, do they feel respected by aid providers, do they feel safe, many, many different aspects of the entirety of aid delivery. And we do that through mixed methods. So we have large-scale quantitative surveys of affected people, where we go into these topics, into many of these topics that I just mentioned. Then we also have qualitative research where we speak with people in a lot more depth. And then around all of that, lots and lots of dialogue with communities, with humanitarians, all in an effort to bring those perceptions to the foreground. So one thing I wanted to talk about at the very beginning is this topic of fairness, because it's something that we speak to affected people about a lot. And in our surveys, we often ask people what fairness means to them and what a fair aid system might look like. And we often find that people say that broader coverage of CVA or of assistance in general would be more fair, because then everybody in their community would receive at least something, even if that meant that everybody would receive a smaller transfer value. And this contrasts quite strongly with how humanitarians like to do things, by targeting the most vulnerable in a community. And we often find, for example, in Nigeria, this quote at the top, this displaced woman said, "Fairness is not about selecting some and leaving some, it's about making sure that everybody is treated equally." And in Somalia in particular, we hear people say, you know, what we get is not much, but many people are left out, so we have to share it. If everybody gets aid, then we won't have to share as much. And I think particularly in Somalia, where we see a large culture of sharing assistance, this has quite an impact on people's ability to plan with the amount of assistance that they have. But it also has quite an impact on community dynamics and tensions in communities. And I think particularly when we're looking at protracted crises, this issue of fairness becomes really interesting, because we often hear people tell us that they find the targeting of aid fairly arbitrary. Why pick some out of a community when everybody is in need? So, you know, to that end, we also ask people about their feelings of resilience. And many people say that that CVA helps them in the very short term, but doesn't help promote their long-term resilience. So many people will say, well, we're not really in a position to think about the future with the amount that we get. People say, you know, we only receive for a few months of the year, and how is that supposed to help me, think about or plan for my future? And so that to that end, we also ask people, if we can move to the next slide, about how designing assistance differently might help them with their resilience. So we ask people in Somalia, would you prefer to receive smaller transfers over a longer period of time, or larger transfers over shorter periods of time? And this assumes, and we explain this to people, that the total amount that they will receive would remain the same. And 60% of people said that they would prefer smaller transfers over longer periods, that would help with their planning. This displaced person in Somalia said, transfers over multiple years would better help me plan for my future. I can save, plan my family's priorities, start a small scale business. A smaller amount of people, only 21%, would prefer larger transfers, so either one-off payments or over maybe just a few months. One example that somebody else in Somalia gave was that a good amount of money at the beginning would help them invest, for example, in a machine that grinds grains in the field, so that later, when they need something, they have that ability to provide a livelihood. So these are just some of the things that we're hearing from people when we talk about this. And I think, you know, as cash actors, we often ask people about what they would prefer in terms of modality. So would you prefer cash? Would you prefer vouchers? What about in-kind aid? But we very rarely ask them to give an opinion on these more complicated issues, or issues around the breadth, the depth of their assistance, about how much and how many people should receive. And I think these will have some interesting impacts on people's resilience in the long run. And so, yeah, on that, I'm excited to hand over to GiveDirectly to Andres, who will give us some more insights on what GiveDirectly's research has found.
Great, thank you so much. First, next slide, please. Next slide. There are a lot of intermediate slides. For all of you who may not be as familiar, GiveDirectly is an international NGO that provides unconditional cash transfers. And a little bit of background that's very important for this session is that GiveDirectly started as thinking of cash transfers as investment size. So most of our programs have been around large transfers, and only recently we've started actually thinking about smaller transfers or transfers that are used for different purposes, but all of them are unconditional and all of them are delivered digitally through mobile phones. Next slide, please. So here are a few stats. I'm not gonna dwell on them, but we've reached about 1.5 million people, raised almost $1 billion. We currently operate in 13 countries, and I promise there was an emoticon there before. We've completed or are currently completing around 19 randomized controlled trials, and our efficiency rate is between 80 and 90%. So that means that for every dollar that we raised, about 80 to 90% goes directly to the recipients. Next slide. And this is kind of in a nutshell what I was talking about in a moment. For the most part, we've been focusing on bucket one, which is large cash transfers. They tend to be around $1,000 in nominal USD. But we've also done things like basic income. So where we provide monthly payments. We are currently doing a pilot in Kenya where we're providing this for up to 12 years. And we have a randomized controlled trial around that. And this is what's more relevant to this crowd. We also have rapid response emergencies. So I'm here with a colleague who works in our humanitarian team. Generally, this is more traditional amounts that are pegged to a minimum expenditure basket. And we also work with complementary programs, Cash Plus. So anything that is unconditional cash with nudges or with working with other agencies that provide complementary services. Next slide, please. And really the core of what I want to talk about is the emergent evidence on recipient preferences. And so one of the core things about GiveDirectly is with our driving star is saying we want to put recipient in the middle because we think that they should have the dignity to choose. And we're kind of taking that to be quite literal and choose not only what they do with their cash transfers, but also elements of the design process itself. And so we've been thinking around this a lot, not just on the research side of things of, in theory, what would people prefer? What does this mean for their impact? But also in practice, what does this mean for operationalization of the technology that allows this to happen? And so I'm going to talk a bit about two pieces of evidence that we've collected, but with the understanding that this is kind of emerging evidence and we want to do a deeper dive into just what is the variety of preferences on different design elements and what that looks like if we operationalize that at scale. Next slide, please. So the first piece the way that we're thinking about this is, given a cash transfer size, what are the preferences around frequency, size, and timing? And so frequency, it would be, if you have $1,000, do you prefer to get it all at once or do you prefer to get it over the span of 12 months? The size would be what amount of that $1,000 you get in the first month versus the 6th month, for example, and the timing would that be at the beginning of the year or towards the end of the year? And so the first thing that we've done is we've done some qualitative work around this with around 191 recipients in 3 different countries. What's emerging from this qualitative work that we did last year is that people prefer not the traditional model that we have, which is one cash transfer 1 month after you're enrolled, but most of recipients tend to prefer transfers that are in different chunks, right? So as we see here from the qualitative work, only 31% prefer one big transfer, and everybody else prefer 2 or more transfers, right? So 42% of the people that we talked with preferred to receive 2 large chunks. And some of the reasons for this echo what Hannah was saying earlier. It gives people the ability to plan. Through the qualitative work, we understand that some people want to have the ability to plan what they're going to do with that money some months down the line, but also they want to time it with the agricultural season. Some people want to time that with education spending. Some people in Kenya that we actually asked this right before the elections, and some people said, we want to get it right before the elections because A, we don't know what's going to happen to prices, and then B, we don't know what's going to happen during the election. So we don't know if we're actually going to get the transfer or not. So these are kind of some of the things that people are mentioning. The second piece of the evidence, if we can move to the next slide, it's a quantitative work that was done by Paul Niehaus, who's a researcher at the University of California, San Diego. And this is with 513 people from Kenya. Again, this is our standard $1,000 transfer amount. And what we did here is we asked people for the preferences at the moment of enrollment, and then they randomize kind of whether you got your preferences or not. And the point of this study is really to understand what people prefer, but if there's any kind of return of investment on people actually getting whatever they prefer. And so the first thing that we see here is about 36% of recipients prefer one large transfer and 63% prefer two large payments. So this is kind of echoing the qualitative work that we had as well. Most recipients prefer to get some cash immediately, but there's a sizable minority, around 30%, that wants some delay. And then the reasons given is, again, to plan agricultural season, also political events. One thing to note about this delay aspect that interacts with one feature of the GiveDirectly model is the following. We normally, even though we deliver this one big transfer, we normally start by giving a small amount of that big transfer just to make sure that people are actually getting the money and that there's no issue with the delivery. And that's pretty standard in all of our programs. What happened in this project is that there was variation in when the people get this small transfer with respect to when they make the choice as to the future big chunks that they're going to get. And so this is important because there's a wide literature that talks about mentality of scarcity, right? If you're under financial stress, you might not make choices that are long-term, but you might make choices that are more focused on the present. And what this study found is that the people who had a little bit of money provided by GiveDirectly before making the choice on the rest of the big chunk actually saw a financial return of 5% just because of that little bit of financial slack, right? So nothing else changed about the transfer size. What changed is that people had a little bit more money and kind of like in the theoretical literature financial slack to be thinking about, okay, am I going to time this with the agricultural season, or am I going to time this with other things? So that's kind of early indication that that these choices might really matter, and that small tweaks about what's happening when people make these choices might actually have a return, even if you fix the transfer amount. And so the last thing I'll say about where this is going from the perspective of GiveDirectly is we want to understand more preferences, how they vary by demographics, how they might vary by countries, because we work in 13 different countries. And for example, this study is just from Kenya. But the other thing is the technology to operationalize this. We have a tech team that's centralized that manages kind of the technology needed to deploy this in all different countries. And we have had conversations with them to understand if it's theoretically possible from the technology point of view to allow people to choose any amount that they want. If we fix the amount, any configuration that they want of the cash transfer, as long as it's one transfer per month and everything is paid over 12 months. So this is from the technology that we have theoretically possible. So it could be anything from getting all the money at once to getting a little bit every month and then getting the rest at the end. So in theory, there could be as many configurations as there are recipients. So from the technology side, that is possible. Now we want to understand things like, okay, how much do preferences vary, for what reasons, and is there any reason to believe that there could be adverse events if we let people actually get whatever choice that they have? So these are kind of some questions in our mind, and this is the future of what we want to do in terms of research. I'm going to end here, and we can engage with some of these questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Andres. I think if we can click forward to, yeah, then I will hand straight over to Francesca from the Somali Cash Consortium.
Thanks, Anna. I'll quickly go through what the Cash Consortium does in Somalia. Next slide, please. So just very briefly on who we are and what we do. The Somali Cash Consortium is led by Concern Worldwide, and it's a consortium of 6 INGO members and 1 M&E agency, and we're specialized in designing and implementing cash transfer programs in Somalia and Somaliland. We have 2 main streams as part of our program. A stream focused on MPCA, so multipurpose cash assistant, which is short-term humanitarian cash programs that usually targets food insecure areas, so IPC 3+, and vulnerable households within these areas. And then we have the longer term program, which is cash-based adaptive social transfer or safety nets, which are longer term, reliable and predictable cash-based social transfer, which are part of larger social protection schemes. And in the case of our programs, they target vulnerable categories. So we currently have 4 models targeting elderly, children and pregnant women, unemployed youth, and people living with disabilities. Next slide, please. So a bit about the consortium. In 2022, we reached over 89,000 households, so over 600,000 individuals. In terms of cash effectiveness for humanitarian cash transfer, we reached 82.5%, and for the social, the cash-based social protection program, about 76%. In terms of the added value of having a consortium providing this program, we have stable, safe, and efficient systems for beneficiary registration and cash delivery, also for us through mobile money, which is used widely across Somalia and Somaliland. We've integrated both humanitarian cash transfer and shock responsive safety net to be able to respond or anticipate the impact of different shocks. So we are really able to reach beneficiaries as a shock hit or just before. We have quite a large membership within the consortium, and that helps us ensure flexibility and capacity to respond across the country where needs arise. Next slide, please. This year, we've revised quite a bit the process and methodology for implementation, really to ensure we align to the Somalia HCT endorsed integrated response framework. And this was really aimed at, first of all, achieving a shorter delivery timeline, which is currently set at 7 days. There's a big focus on having cash programs integrating a lot more with other sectors, particularly WASH, health, nutrition, and protection. And really important, and we're going to go a lot more through this, the ability to target the most marginalized and food insecure households within drought affected and food insecure districts. And again, we'll talk later about what to do when needs increase, but not necessarily resources to scale increase as well. And then again, because we are a consortium and we have a number of partners across the consortium and we cover many areas, to minimize duplication and build in complementarity, we have a number of data sharing agreements, both with other large-scale programs in other sectors, to really be able to integrate across different sectoral responses, but also with other large-scale cash actors like WFP. And we're now collaborating with WFP and ICRC in country to set up a deduplication platform. And again, I think the duplication will come back again later. Next slide, please. And then just the last point, which has been very key to us, and we really see that as the way forward for the response in Somalia. It's about the transition from humanitarian cash transfer to long-term, predictable and reliable safety nets. So there is an overall consensus in the country on the need to transition from these repeated cycles of humanitarian assistance to longer-term solution, whether these are part of social protection schemes, durable solution programs, or resilience building, really targeting protracted IDPs or the chronic poor, which is in Somalia amount for about 80% of the population. We see safety net as a key in this transition because it allows the delivery of long-term, reliable and continuous cash-based assistance to a large percentage of the population, and this can be expanded in anticipation or in response of shocks to cushion the impact of shocks on population receiving this longer-term cash-based assistance. Also, as mentioned before by GiveDirectly, an important part for us was, and thanks to the experience of our partners, the ability to deliver BCC messages linked to health and nutrition-seeking behavior, but also livelihood promotion and others, really to strengthen further the resilience building objective of the social transfer program. Mindset from emergency to longer term, the consortium recruited specific skills to support this transition and really supporting changing the mindset that I think we've had for a long time in Somalia. And again, I think we'll go into further details of this later, but at the moment, how we've linked humanitarian and longer term program has been the ability of this longer term program to scale up when needed. But going forward, what we would envision would be really to transition humanitarian caseload into longer term programs, which wasn't possible yet, but it's what we're kind of aiming to in the future. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Francesca. I think it's really, really great to hear about your work pulling together all of these different organizations. And yeah, I think we'll come back to a lot more of that later. But yeah, for now, I'll hand over to Liam.
Thanks, Hannah. So I am a bit of an outlier on the panel in that Andres, the two Francescas are from organizations that are actually doing the work. At ECHO, we don't do much. We fund the programs. So my job is far easier than what the other colleagues on the panel do. With that said, I mean, we have our own global cash policy that we updated and released last year. And obviously, as the humanitarian side of the EU house, it's predominantly focused on humanitarian cash transfer, some of the points that Francesca was just describing. But within that global policy, we also have clearly articulated, I think, that the linkages between social protection and the needs to link humanitarian with social protection or other development assistance to kind of get people off that never-ending humanitarian cycle. And so there's a lot in there, and that's very much a focus of our cash work, taking that nexus perspective. We do fund, so we fund quite a significant amount of similarly unrestricted multi-purpose cash assistance in Somalia and other contexts. But then we also contribute to these social protection programs. So we work quite closely with colleagues in the World Bank, in other EU institutions, so DG ECHO, for example. We work with Germany, with CEDA, with Norway to an extent on trying to bridge that divide between what we as humanitarians do and then what we would like people to transition towards. And yeah, kind of alongside all of that work, the coordination, the policy stuff, we also invest quite substantially in the kind of M&E learning agenda. So we're interested in trying to figure out practically, tangibly, how do we overcome, how do we bridge that gap? I don't think there are any great solutions. There are not necessarily wonderful examples of that happening so far. And then we get into all of these quite complex discussions around people's preferences. Do you prefer smaller amounts over a longer term? Is that a development thing? Is it fair to say that's development rather than humanitarian? Preferences around duration, not only transfer values, but frequency, things like this. So there's a lot of considerations there, a lot of variables, let's say, when you construct a cash program, and especially when you try to bridge that nexus gap, which we're also quite interested in. So I won't say too much, but looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much. And then I'll hand over then to our final Francesca De Celia from WFP to hopefully give us an insight into the how implementers are thinking about these decisions as well.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks a lot. Really interesting debate. I am so excited because this is something that is not a theoretical issue. It's something that we're really, and sometimes within organizations, we discuss it among ourselves and with communities, but like even just having this very frank discussion on this, it's very helpful for us. Today, as we speak, there are so many of our colleagues of the countries where we work that are grappling with this issue, particularly of how to engage communities. Honestly, it's not a new topic, right? And it's not unique to cash transfers or to humanitarian action. Governments have to deal with this and have to deal with this topic for a long time. I have decided not to have slides and had decided not to present much of what WFP is doing, but I think just briefly it is very relevant because, again, coming from a global perspective, this topic, of course, takes different nuances in different types of programs and different contexts. This is, again, as WFP, we support people, 56 million people last year in 72 countries, delivering more than $3 billion in assistance. That doesn't mean much in of itself because the scale is renowned. But what we're trying to do is like leverage this scale to actually turn things on their head and really put people at the center and walk the talk on the commitments that we have. So as I was thinking about this topic, I was relooking at all our also tools that we use at country level to engage with communities. Honestly, on paper, we have everything, like even on integrating community perspectives and involving and discussing and co-creating on all the design issues that you want. But is this really happening in practice? Honestly, not that much, particularly on the breadth versus depth issue. So I'd really like to hone in on this one, which is the hardest question of all. I think that as we ask about choices and preferences, and we discuss with communities issues about frequency and about entitlement levels and lump sums or more frequent payments. I mean, the cash, the beauty of digital cash in particular is that the options are endless. The sky is the limit in terms of options. But when it's about who's in and who's out, that's where the really harder discussion comes, right? And ultimately, I want to say that we really challenging ourselves. I think this panel is challenging ourselves, and WFP is, and you will see we will have the executive board will approve a new cash policy in June this year. So we hope to have some of these broad external events immediately after it is approved to share our thinking. And again, what does it mean to put people at the center? We're trying to use user journey and user experience design that actually, based on ground truth solutions, methodologies, and many other partners, learning from all of you and all of us to understand why people have certain choices and preferences, and also who are we speaking about? Is it women, men? Is it the elderly? Is it different types of groups? And we know also that this is not a decision that we can fully simply outsource to communities, because there are issues of discrimination, of an exclusion, that just by simply putting the responsibility on the community, we will not necessarily solve, but it should be really joined. So again, I think that on paper, as WFP, we have a lot of tools for community engagement, for targeting and prioritization, for transfer value setting, for all of these very interrelated program design topics. But in the reality, what we suffer with is a lack of visibility on what's going to happen. So as a voluntarily funded organization, as much as big as we are, we still often in country office, and my experiences are from different regions, Asia and Africa and Latin America, is that we don't know actually the end, the duration of the whole program, or when the let's say the pipeline breaks, or when we have issues with funds coming in. Oftentimes we know maybe 3 months before. So the community engagement process is extremely difficult, because you would like to give that predictability that was mentioned. People, even with a small transfer, when the small transfer is predictable, people can take small risks, can invest and in micro entrepreneurs initiatives, etc., and build their financial resilience. But that also we have to realize that humanitarian cash, even ours and yours and all of them, they are just one of the payments or one of the components of their lives, right? So again, we often don't look at remittances, for instance, as actually the biggest safety net out there. We don't necessarily enough look at how humanitarian cash transfers complement social cash transfers, etc. And that's another debate we can have also a little bit later, and I can share a bit of that. But ultimately, involving the people is a non-negotiable in decisions that impact their lives, and the tools are extremely relevant. But then when you go out there, it's also, we have sometimes contradicting methodology or contradicting objectives. Again, we have to look at programmatic objectives from WFP side. When I say that we have programs all over the world, that 90% of all the cash-based transfers we have provided last year was unconditional resource transfers as well to people. This is a trend we want to continue, and again, even in the policy, it's going to be very forthcoming, and particularly unrestricted cash, so that people can choose. We also want to make sure, though, that they can choose where to receive the money. So instead of, again, us humanitarians deciding the financial service provider, the mobile money company, etc., why don't we first check where do they normally receive their money from their families, for instance, if they do have accounts or not? Can we have them choose where to receive the money? In this case, also, it does have an influence as well on the impact discussion, because it's not about us setting up a delivery mechanisms or a system just for the humanitarian cash, but really building on the way that they live. And again, for me, it's about simplicity. So some of the principles we try to follow also for the breadth versus depth is simplicity and agility and flexibility, because there will be moments on time where we have to scale up and scale down, and the ability of doing so together with the communities is critical. I mean, last year with the global food crisis, WFP delivered 42% more cash than the previous year. It's a huge increase, right? And now this year we are seeing actually scale down, unfortunately, in so many contexts and operations. But we do need that possibility to expand and contract as well as needed. And again, I think that in the debate on cash transfers, the digital payments side has also sometimes questioned at the very beginning. I remember many years ago, of course, was also like, are we less connected to communities because we are digitally paying them, and then we have less face-to-face interactions, for instance? I don't think that is the case. I think we actually have doubled up the opportunities to engage with people in a face-to-face manner, as well as digitally. Community feedback mechanisms and customer service of mobile money agents and companies that we use, I think they are also have evolved greatly to have a two-way communication and also asking about this. So again, there is no excuse to some extent that what I would like to say to ask the people. And also, this is maybe another last comment from my side is, for me, we again, collective, we as humanitarians take this too scientifically or too technically, when this is particularly this topic of breadth versus depth. It's really about culture and about sharing practices and social norms and really power imbalances in communities. If we don't understand these aspects much more deeply through these types of researches that also are based on perceptions and are really constant, proactive and early engagement with communities, we will not get there. If we again, it's also a call, of course, to donors and others. If we don't have visibility on what's going to happen, how can we not be reactive? Oftentimes we are still, unfortunately, reactive. There are some also ways of targeting methods that are more amenable, let's say, or easier to scale up and scale down, and easier to communicate and also discuss together. Categorical targeting and changing certain thresholds for that is certainly an easier topic than means testing or proxy means testing type of approaches, where it's so hard to describe, to even explain, even the basics, just explaining why someone is considered more vulnerable than others is not an option, or very, very difficult. So I would, I think I really liked the evidence that is emerging, evidence that is coming up from GiveDirectly and from Ground Truth Solutions, from WP. We're thirsty and eager to take all of this and to use it and apply it at scale, and to really learn and do this better with the people we serve in very, very different and extremely difficult contexts. So for now, I'd keep it to that, and then we can engage in the dialogue. So I hope I started a little bit more on the flow of the debate. Thanks. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of really interesting points there. But I think, you know, the point that you ended on is that, you know, this is so different in different contexts, and people's preferences are undoubtedly also driven largely by their culture, by the other types of aid they're receiving, and, you know, all these other factors. So I think, you know, what you said about having to make sure that we're engaging with communities consistently throughout is going to be really important in getting some answers to these questions. And I think as well, we mustn't try and get to the perfect answer in this session. I mean, in an hour and a half, that was never going to happen anyway. But also, I think there is probably no one answer to what is the ideal way of doing this, but just many different things that could be done in various contexts. And you know, that leads me to maybe my first question for Andres, and for maybe from GiveDirectly's perspective. You know, you already spoke a bit about the evidence base that you're collecting, and I'm wondering, you know, can we say that there is an optimal cadence for transfers, an optimal amount and at certain time periods that helps people promote resilience, and yeah, under what circumstances?
That's the magic question. I guess I would answer by saying that this is probably more of the actual optimal amount is probably more an art than a science. But there is a lot of evidence on large transfers leading to big returns on investment. And so what GiveDirectly has been traditionally involved with is this $1,000, right? And the reason why it's large is because it's supposed to break the cycles of poverty enough for people to invest. But whether it's $1,000 or 900 or 1,100 is kind of not something that we have investigated at length, and is probably more of like a judgment call. Regardless of that, there's evidence that there are all sorts of positive spillovers based on this transfer amount. At the individual level, people have returns on assets, consumption. At the community level, one study that came out recently, same author as this paper that I just presented, we gave around 15% of local GDP in a community in Kenya, and that generated positive spillovers of 2.5. So for every $1,000 that we invested, the local community grew by like 2,500. And that's because I get the money, I spend it in the market, that person gets the money, spends it somewhere else. And so while, you know, it's kind of hard to say what is the right transfer amount, we have some evidence, we have some thinking around this as well. It's not that we haven't really engaged with this question. And one of our thinking is like, maybe theoretically, people could use a flow payments before they get a big amount, so that they address their immediate needs first and then they can invest. Or in the other way, they can first invest in something and then have some cash transfers after that to kind of smooth consumption while the returns from the initial investment are realized. And so I don't think that we have evidence on either of those designs. we have good reasons to believe that a combination of flow and by flow, I mean like recurring payments, some combination of a large amount and smaller amounts could be useful, particularly because the evidence from this as well suggests that if you have slack, you make better decisions, even if you keep things the same. And also evidence coming from graduation approaches that usually combine one big asset with some amount of transfers. Kind of suggests that there is this combination where there's a time when there's a return on investment. And the way that the big small amounts plays into this is that normally in these big graduation programs, we kind of choose what the asset will be for people. So we say like, we're going to give you a goat because goats are the things that you can buy here. But maybe you can just let people choose by giving them cash. They make the investment that they see fit in that context. And then the flow kind of allows them to smooth consumption while the returns materialize a few months or a year later on. So in conclusion, some good evidence for large amounts. The exact amount is ambiguous, but there's a lot of thinking around this combination of small amounts and large amounts that could potentially kind of be more beneficial in the longer term than either or alone.
Yeah, please.
What's the smallest amount you give?
The smallest amount is mostly in our humanitarian programs, around $30 to $40 for a few months, depending on the minimum expenditure basket.
Yeah, and please, if there's any questions online, there is a Q&A box which Heba is monitoring, or you can raise your hand, and anybody in the room at any time, yeah, please do raise your hand. And I think, yeah, this is where it's very difficult then to come up with one answer, which we said we weren't going to try and do anyway. But I think a lot of what you're talking about in the evidence that you have, Andres, is from more development programs, right? And I'm wondering if Francesca from Somali Cash Consortium would maybe also be able to speak on this question a little bit. And you know, when Andres is talking about people graduating from these larger sum transfers onto maybe smaller amounts of assistance, I mean, that very much links with the work that you're doing with humanitarian cash and linking it with social protection. So do you have evidence from your side about what maximizes impact?
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, absolutely. And we've looked into that as well. I think maybe just to start with, we very much see these programs having different objectives. So when it comes to the humanitarian cash transfer, it's really life-saving assistance that needs to enable recipients to access basic needs and services, while for the longer term, the social transfer safety net programs, then the objective is like poverty reduction and prevention, and really build resilience and level out inequalities in the communities where we're present. But I think that's also an important distinction to keep in mind. In 2018, the consortium conducted a study really to look how different amounts and frequencies of, in this case, emergency cash transfers were impacting household food security indicators, but also other known food outcomes like ability to cope with shocks and stresses, financial and household well-being. And we had 3 different groups. A group was receiving $70 a month for 3 months. Another group was receiving $70 every other month for 6 months. And then a group was receiving $35 for 6 months. So at the end of the program, the amount was the same across, but the way it was dispersed and the frequency, was different. The result shows slight, but not very statistically significant, higher impact for the monthly. So everyone that was receiving $70, but every other month. But overall, like the results from the study were really indicating that households were able to manage their savings and their expenditure, adapting to the different disbursement schedules that were given. Obviously, because now we have a humanitarian program, like a humanitarian cash transfer program, as well as a social transfer safety net program, we're also able to compare data that we've collected more recently, like end of last year. And if we look at one of our social transfer model that provided 12 months of cash transfer at 20 USD a month, to our emergency program that was providing back then, when we did this comparison, 60 USD a month for 3 months. So keeping in mind that it's hard to compare these two programs because the final values were different. There was no randomization used, and it was different set of populations. The impact, especially on the food security outcome, was higher on the humanitarian caseload. So those that received a higher value for shorter. Obviously, I think what this is missing and what we're planning to do this year is, okay, at the end of each program, we see at end line the difference in the indicators. But what about 6-9 months from the end of a humanitarian program? Will those households still be better off or not? And that's what we're going to look into next. So in the longer term, when we focus on resilient building rather than this immediate food security outcomes, how will households be at that moment in time later on, once the program has been over for a number of time? So that's kind of the evidence from our side on like frequency, transfer values, etc.
Wonderful, thanks. And I think it's a really important point that you mentioned about, not conflating humanitarian cash and social protection too much, that these often do have very, very different objectives and target populations. I think we did have a hand up online, but it has now disappeared. But if anybody would like to rethink and raise their hand again, you can feel free to unmute.
My hand is actually up.
I don't see it anymore, apologies, but please, go ahead with your question.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Miriam Laker from GiveDirectly. Super proud of Andres over there. My question is to I want to hear from the donor in the room. So like we all know, the amount of humanitarian aid that is dedicated to cash and voucher assistance went up, and then it has stagnated for quite a while now. Would like to know from you, are there any gaps you're seeing as donors in the way CVAs are being used that is making you hesitant to increase the allotment to cash and voucher assistance in the humanitarian sector?
Thanks, Miriam, for picking on the donor in the room. Good question. I think speaking only from an ECHO perspective, the amount that we allocate towards cash has only increased, and I don't expect that trend to change. In terms of gaps, it doesn't mean though that we don't see gaps. So I mentioned one in the introduction, which is very much bridging this humanitarian development divide. So obviously you can't give people humanitarian cash transfers forever. That's unsustainable, it's untenable. But then how do you build on those minimum gains that Francesca just mentioned and make sure that people don't relapse into a situation where they require humanitarian assistance? So that's one. Secondly, I think the integration of cash with other key services is also quite important. In a humanitarian setting, just because you give somebody $60 or $100, you might give them enough money to buy food, to keep their children alive, to buy water. It doesn't mean that they can also afford to send those children to school. It doesn't mean that they can afford transport to get to a health facility. It doesn't mean that any protection needs might be addressed, for example. So I think it's in Somalia, for example, there's a lot of good work being done on the integration of other services to really try to capitalize on those humanitarian gains and bring people up to a minimum level where they can then exit humanitarian programs onto something hopefully a bit more sustainable.
Thanks, and I think that's sorry, Miriam, but yeah, I think that's an interesting point about, and it's also something that that Francesca mentioned about integrating, when you talked about integrating cash with other key services, Francesca De Celia was also talking about bearing in mind the other sources of income that people might have, whether that be social assistance in addition to humanitarian cash, whether it be remittances, which we know is a large, certainly an impactful factor in Somalia, and other aid. So I wonder, Francesca, how do you, from an implementer's point of view, go about bringing all of those different factors into account when deciding, when going from this theoretical evidence base into practical decisions? How do you bring all of that into account?
Thank you. Yes, indeed. I mean, I don't want to repeat things that others have said. I think these types of considerations we also take. For instance, again, program objectives like primary objectives, life-saving, but also, of course, whether we are looking at meeting essential needs, which is really what we all strive for, that people can meet their basic needs, because this also influences food security outcomes. Of course, from WP, our mandate and our mission is food security and nutrition. And for that, there are specific considerations as well for frequency, timing, for sure, and size. So what we look at is we normally try to keep really the breadth of the transfer as much as possible, particularly as we know that for some specific groups, really falling off any assistance is going to have dire consequences on nutrition and also on selling assets, and very, very negative coping mechanisms. So the questions to be asked is also, what happens if a group of least vulnerable, that is often poorly defined, just doesn't get any assistance at all, right? So I have also found that we're not using enough of some good practices from the social protection sector, which is, again, tiering and it's partly a little bit what GiveDirectly said, even if we use different wording, but again, having a basic grant a flow, a recurrent grant that even it's low, but it's predictable and it's continuing to build, particularly when you do digital payments, a credit history and an opportunity to access other services, etc. But on top of that, have top-ups for either specific periods of the year. We do a lot of also of seasonal assistance as well in specific periods, as well as for specific groups or during specific periods, like, again, the start of the school, etc. I think this is, again, a more complicated approach if you start to look at basic grant plus top-ups, but it is something that it is certainly possible. It is possibly less creating less tensions than just either breadth or depth. That's why we don't really like to say breadth versus depth. I think there is a lot of in between in the spectrum of approaches. I mean, the frequency, for instance, if you look at the evidence, and I was speaking to the nutrition colleagues about this, when we really look at healthy diets and the need to buy fresh foods, etc., as we are moving away more and more from vouchers into unrestricted cash, and even in the nutrition area and the global nutrition cluster, evidence says that unrestricted cash and unconditional cash, when accompanied with SBCC, social behavior change, but also good design tweaks, can lead to very positive nutrition outcomes. So more frequent payments often help, for instance, people to buy these types of products or make these choices. But we are very much in favor of lump sums as well, and this also creates efficiency. And I think that one topic as well is like, breadth versus depth is ideally we wouldn't even want to go there, right? We are forced to prioritize. We really prefer to speak about these are the total needs that we're seeing, and this is what people need right now, and this is what they're telling us. And how can we make the assistance we provide the most efficient possible through any way, so that we don't have to face or have at least limit the trade-offs that we have to make with them in these decisions. And there's a lot of things that we're looking at for efficiency. Of course, economies of scale help in efficiencies, and we have very highly efficient programs, but at the same time that we need to maximize the impact. No, so again, the complementarity, the services, the pluses, let's say, even if we don't call it cash fast, I think every cash, even a basic humanitarian transfer, has a lot of pluses by the way we design and deliver. I've heard a lot about resilience, and really we're looking at building financial resilience of people so that families, women and men and their children, they can withstand shocks and take better care of themselves alone. It's not necessarily, graduation per se, but again, the way we provide even humanitarian cash transfers in a way that builds this financial resilience, we find digital financial inclusion, and again, the digital payments, opening a whole new spectrum of options to increase efficiency and effectiveness of operations, and to have people be able to access different services that even in protracted refugee crisis we have seen very much picking up. And again, we also, with the breadth versus depth issue, we also look not just at the people we're serving, but the spillover effects on non-eligible households are really strong. I think it was GiveDirectly again mentioned 2.5 return on investment in your studies, and this is actually very similar. It's 1 to 1.5 to 2.5 return on investment in a lot of studies we've done in sub-Saharan Africa, and others have done. We try to really use that evidence. So I think that it's always a combination of factors. Normally we try to keep the breadth at the beginning, and for at least when we see that the resources are shrinking, to advocate with partners with more resources to come in, and to really avoid very negative coping mechanism for the people we serve. And then after years, in some contexts, I mean, I know we have done this in I don't want to mention specific countries. I have many examples actually right now, but it's so different country to country. But we have done it with UNHCR, moving from a status-based type of targeting to a needs-based, and an analysis of different categories of vulnerability. So very highly vulnerable that would really suffer if you go really low. And how low is too low? I think it's an answer that no one has ever actually responded to. But then a group that has recurring needs, that is moderately vulnerable to food insecurity and meeting essential needs, and then one that is clearly less vulnerable. After years, we know that also people have different ways of achieving income, and sometimes again the communities themselves, they recognize that some people need less of that recurrent support. So over from my side for now. And again, sorry, last point I want to make about efficiency and effectiveness, but also really about the best investment. And we are putting it very clearly in our policies, like investing on women, and as main recipients of the cash transfers, bring make the cash go very much further. It's a smart thing to do, not just the right thing to do. They take very good decisions, and also again enables them to be economically empowered. And this has triggers that are very much studied on the local economy, but also on GDP and more. So it is very deliberate investments in this design priorities that we're making, very much aligned, again, essential needs and unconditional restricted cash and choice as much as possible, really embracing it as one way of delivering better, and bringing on board our donors in this vision. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Yeah, I mean, I think to pick on one thing you said, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to be deciding between breadth versus depth of assistance, but I don't want to pick on the donor in the room too much. Otherwise he might leave. And so what I did want to ask next is, you mentioned how low is too low. If we try and expand programs with the same pot of funds to a larger portion of the community, then the amount that they receive obviously gets very low. One thing that we have found in our research is to do with exclusion, particularly in the Somalia context. I mean, we know that exclusion from assistance is a real issue, that many people feel they are left out, particularly based on issues like clan affiliation. And it is very hard to agree on community-based targeting in situations like this. And so in our research, we found some people saying it would be better if aid went to everybody in the community, because then you would reduce those exclusion errors. And I wanted to ask you, Liam, what you thought about that. Is that something that you think might help solve the issue of exclusion, or not?
Hard no.
Hard no.
Hard
okay.
no. So I mean, obviously this is a very complex topic where it's difficult to have quite a strong conviction on anything. But I think this point is one that we should actually have quite an evidence-based but a strong view on. And tying it back to maybe the question of the session, I think, what if we let people decide? The question within that is which people? who decides?
Mm.
So typically speaking, in Somalia, I mean, Somalia is a very divided society, as many societies are. You can take any example. You can take the richest society in the world, and an example like if, for example, your parents go to Harvard Business School, you're more likely to go to Harvard Business School. If you go to Harvard Business School, network means that you're more likely to get a job with McKinsey or whatever, you know, like JP Morgan, whatever it is. That's a division in the society. If you're from the Bronx, and you don't look like the guys whose parents went to Harvard Business School, you're not going to have the same opportunities. So this kind of division or inequality or stratification, socioeconomic stratification of societies is something which happens in most, I would say, societies, but particularly so in Somalia. And one of the big variables is the clan affiliation, as you mentioned. So your clan affiliation essentially is one of the main determining factors on whether you receive assistance or you don't. And that's because those equivalents of Harvard Business School people are the ones that work for UN agencies and INGOs, and they work in the government. And they're subject to unconscious bias. They're subject to community pressures. They might just not know where the marginalized minority group that's historically not received any assistance and might be at the bottom, in the bottom quintile of the socioeconomic ladder, where they are, or what their needs are. So there are all sorts of kind of issues there to be aware of. And the way that most cash assistance in Somalia is done is with community-based targeting, which means a representative of my organization, whatever that is, usually from a certain socioeconomic background, let's say, or a clan background, goes to a particular community and asks the leaders of those communities, who are the people that meet these vulnerability criteria? And then those community leaders benevolently or malevolently will give a list to say, these are the people in my community that I think deserve humanitarian assistance. So if you go and ask them, if you let them decide, then you'll end up in a situation where the people that eventually receive assistance are not anywhere near the most vulnerable. And there's pretty good evidence from humanitarian programming, from social protection programming on the, let's call it, inefficiencies or inclusion-exclusion error. So essentially inadvertently targeting the wrong people, giving people the wrong people assistance, people that don't need it, to the exclusion, to the detriment of other people. So I think in principle, we would all agree that yes, engaging with communities, having their preferences on things like duration, on frequency, maybe on values, for example, is a good principle. But we also need to be aware enough of a given context that we work in, on who we're speaking to and what their vested interests might be. I don't think you can draw the same conclusions by asking rural farmers in Kenya, for example, what their preferences might be, because they're going to be very, very different to somebody who's from a historically marginalized clan with children who are literally starving to death in front of them. I doubt they're going to want money to buy farm equipment, for example. So I think that stratification of evidence is equally important, and making generalizations could be quite dangerous.
Mm-hmm. No, certainly, and I think we would certainly all agree here. Francesca, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I wanted to build on what Liam just said, also from the social protection aspect, and Francesca mentioned before as well about categorical targeting. As part of our social transfer program, we have piloted categorical targeting in Somalia. So one of the biggest model is referral-based categorical targeting, where pregnant women are verified at a health clinic for eligibility, and any pregnant woman can be enrolled into the program. So really following the life cycle approach in social protection, where at certain point in everyone's life, you will be required extra support. And obviously, when a new member comes in a household, the household incomes and saving decrease per capita. You're likely to move down in income decile ranking. And in a country like Somalia, there's no maternity leave. So it's also actual income within the household might decrease as a result. And we've seen that in terms of preference from the communities, we did a lot of qualitative data collection on this. communities find very fair that pregnant women would be targeted for a program because they really see that moment in life is when the household needs additional support. They really appreciate the fact that it's very objectively verifiable. So there's no misunderstanding on, as Francesca mentioned before, PMT. Oh, I have 3 goats more and a slightly better roof than my neighbor, so I didn't get cash in a country where 80% of the population lives in poverty. So in a country like Somalia, we really see PMT as extremely difficult to explain and rationalize. It's not perceived as a fair process, while we have objectively verifiable criteria that are well understood and agreed by the communities and the government, because at the end of the day, social protection programs are under the government responsibility, agreed to be key moments in life where extra supports needs to be provided. So just to add maybe less on the humanitarian side, what Liam mentioned, but also on the social protection side. Thanks.
If I may add just a quick thought on that, definitely agree with Liam on the context really matters. So, and preferences are definitely going to be different for somebody in Kenya, somebody in Somalia. One thing that we've been doing in Malawi is actually thinking about different targeting approaches, more from the perspective of PMT, or whether we can do remote targeting with correlates like cell phone usage or geographical targeting. But one thing that did come up, to echo what Francesca was saying, at least for the PMT, that people felt it was unfair and mostly about the exclusion, because just like similar to this context in Malawi, there's no conflict, so to speak, but 80% of people or more, depending on the region, live under the poverty line that we use to target some of these things. So it is very salient for a lot of people saying, oh, you have slightly better roof, therefore you didn't get the transfer, where everybody's basically around the same cutoff. So just wanted to echo that at least in Malawi, we also see this perception of fairness as people particularly worried about who's going to be left behind in a context where everybody's very similar.
Yeah, and I think that's something we come up with time and again, this feeling that aid is either unfair or arbitrary because I don't really understand who has gotten what and why. I think is really very important. I think we had one hand up in the room. Please go ahead.
Hello, I'm another donor, so I thought I should speak up.
On your own, Liam.
Thanks for the moral support.
I'm from the U.S. State Department Population, Refugees and Migration Bureau. We don't ever tell our partners how much they should be doing in cash. And so somewhat embarrassingly, I can't tell you how much we do in cash, but we do a ton.
Susie, my playmate, won't you come play with me? My father's got the flu.
Okay.
And pops
Anyway,
and measles too. Lay down the drain pipe onto the yellow wall forevermore.
I think we can mute.
Onto the yellow wall, and we'll be happy. Therefore.
So sorry. Okay, I think we got it. Sorry about that, everybody.
Music in the background is what I'm always wanting.
You were saying you do a ton of cash.
We fund about 80% multilaterally, and our partners do a ton of cash. We worked very hard through the grand bargain to get guidelines on a coordination of cash programming in countries, because it's been very unpredictable to figure out who is doing cash, and does this agency's cash match up with that agency's cash in a coordinated, coherent way, which we think is pretty important. But going back to the subject of the discussion today, I'd like to ask what agencies actually do the consultation with the population before putting the program design together. We've heard a lot about the research that's done afterwards about what they would have liked or what they were okay with. But I'd like to, we're trying very hard to figure out, and I don't think I have the answer, so don't worry about that, but trying to figure out what is the way one should approach program design with the people in the culture, because as many have said, we have a lot of cultural contexts that are very different from each other. And from one way GiveDirectly described it, I thought, okay, well, if you give the cash to the wealthiest people in the community, then it'll have the greatest chance of spreading the furthest and multiplying because they will spend it. They don't need it for themselves too much. And I thought that's not what they meant, obviously. But how do you then get from that approach down to the humanitarian targeting? And how do you involve the people? That's what I'm interested in. Thank you.
I wonder if before we let you all take a stab at that, there was another hand in the audience.
I mean, probably you have much more qualified answers to this, yeah, but this is something that I realized like over the last couple of days. I'm Thomas, by the way. We are all talking about collaboration and whatsoever, but in the end, the strategic planning is always or mostly in the hand of, like, let's say, outsiders. So we also heard from, I think it was Francesca from WFP, that we utilize tools like UX design, user journey maps and whatsoever, that are not adequate for the context that we are actually dealing with. We are dealing with like much more complexity. We are dealing with interconnectedness of different sectors and stuff. So I'm wondering, and now replying to your thing, isn't something that would be called strategic design by now, that is a highly collaborative process that tries to build capacities, that looks at overall networks from a meta level, but also from a micro level, appropriate to do the strategic planning in the beginning. And then my question is, like, to the donors, why aren't these processes really funded?
Another comment in the room? Yeah, please.
So,
Yeah.
my name's Alison. I wear two hats. One is I'm the founder and I run an NGO working directly with communities who receive no aid, but they're post-conflict and are building their lives after a 20-year war. So I work with the people there. The other hat is going right up to your point at that high level I work for a geospatial analysis company working in international development. So I was wondering how you bring the two together to answer the questions of that very small NGO working on the ground with people understanding their needs. So do you use WFP, Mr. Donor, Madam Donor, things like geospatial analysis to do that very high level multi-layered analysis to understand and target communities, then monitor their progress to be able to plan what happens in 6 to 9 months after a program leaves? Sorry.
No, it's very, very rich questions.
Oh, and the women, sorry, and the women. So where we work in our villages, we talk about targeting women, but the women are responsible for the farming, the family, the feeding, but they ain't responsible for finance, and none of them have mobile phones, so they can't receive mobile money. And we do transactions down to like $1 directly to people, so we go very small, and 50p. To pay for a child to have malaria treatment, we can send it, so it arrives. So the women should be targeted, Francesca, WFP, but how do you do it when they have no power, no control over their lives or anything to do with money? Sorry.
It's the big question, and I did actually want to come to a point about gender and all of this as well. So maybe I'll pin that one for now, while we talk about design, but I will definitely come back to it. I don't know. Liam, maybe do you want to take a stab at that question around designing programs? Like, do donors have something in place that will allow organizations to consult the community in advance, work out what needs to be done, and then submit the proposal, and not do everything as an afterthought?
Yeah, we would hope for it, in fact, and we're quite prepared to pay for it as well. But I think too often programs end up, especially in a protracted crisis, just kind of rolling on and on and on, and you copy paste whatever you did, or you use very too high level aggregate information. In the Horn of Africa, for example, IPC is often used as a proxy, effectively. The problem with it is that you end up taking a map of Somalia, breaking it down at the district or regional level, painting it different colors, and then targeting or designing your program on that basis. It doesn't work. Because obviously society is stratified, whether you use an IPC scale, for example, but the IPC 5 people could be in fact, in the capital city as much as they are in a particular rural area. And so that very high level information, which is often used, is not that helpful. So what we would hope for and are quite prepared to fund is needs assessments. It's like humanitarian 101. Go and talk to a community, figure out at the household level who's in IPC5, who has higher vulnerabilities protection needs or whatever. But obviously there's a trade-off there, because going around house to house or tent to tent in a displacement setting is going to take a lot of time. And humanitarian obviously is always under a lot of time pressure, especially Somalia the last 2 years when we've been kind of this close to a famine. It's that pressure of doing things now, doing things immediately, but then trading off some of the nuance, the detail, the household level for timeliness. Just getting the money out quickly. But I mean, in principle, we would prefer to see that, but that trade-off, that balance is really for WFP and the Cash Consortium and others to determine.
And I think it's also a question of flexibility. I mean, there was a cash session yesterday where we were talking about this, and you know, do donors give organizations the necessary flexibility to be able to say, okay, we're going to go out and, you know, find out what the needs are, find out what the community preferences would be, and then, you know, our indicators might change and our program approach might change, but yeah, that flexibility needs to be there for that. I'm slightly aware of the fact that we've only got 10 minutes left. I think we had a hand up online. If anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, then please feel free.
Yeah, sure. I'm John Nelson. I'm a cash and markets advisor supporting the Myanmar operation. Yeah, my comment is kind of regarding the you know, thinking about how, you know, in a lot of contexts, including Myanmar, we just have huge funding shortages and lots of unmet needs. And I'm curious to hear from the panel maybe if there's any data like on kind of the diminishing returns of a transfer, because I've seen some data from like IFPRI in Myanmar that shows like that at some point, you know, you do see a diminishing return on key outcome indicators, whether it's, you know, poverty rates or food consumption scores, these types of things, livelihood coping strategy. And I think like in the cash community, like we're really focused on you know, assessing the needs of beneficiaries, whether it's tying transfers to the minimum expenditure basket or food baskets, really trying to meet, you know, the needs that are evident or that are present. But you know, maybe with this idea of diminishing returns of a transfer, maybe you know, actually not meeting all the needs is maybe a way to have a larger impact overall, given all of these resource constraints. So wasn't sure if there was any thoughts on that. Thanks.
Is there anybody on the panel that would like to take that one and answer?
I could take it unless Francesca, you'd like to go. Cash Consortium, Francesca.
Yeah.
You can go first and I can add, happy to.
Thanks. Thanks, John. I think, yeah, there's a bit of evidence. I wouldn't say it's hard and fast and statistically relevant, backed up and all the rest of it, but essentially after kind of 3 months of cash assistance, you can get people from being in a really serious situation to a decent level, whether you use food security outcome indicators as your, again, proxies or something else. And then after 3 months, it really kind of tails off. And that's one of the data points that we've used, or the Cash Working Group, WFP, the Cash Consortium, and others have used to issue guidance on the initial duration of humanitarian cash assistance in Somalia. So considering resource constraints, considering the enormity of the caseload in Somalia, that somewhat arbitrary, somewhat data-based decision to give a minimum of 3 months cash assistance was kind of issued out in guidance to all of the cash partners. Francesca mentioned it earlier, but there's also evidence to say that will drop off, and so people will regress and go back into a worse situation unless something else is done. So that's when we come back to this question of linking other services, whether it's humanitarian or development, and referring people out ideally onto kind of social protection systems to maintain that baseline of resilience that humanitarian programming has been able to build. Similarly, though, from a social protection perspective, there's also evidence which says if you give people the $20 a month over 12 months, and then you have a shock as huge as the shock in Somalia with this prolonged extreme drought hits, then their resilience is obviously going to be eroded. That's not enough either. And then that's when we get into the realm of shock responsive social protection and how do you build mechanisms into that system to deal with the shock and make sure that resilience is not eroded away. Francesca, I'm sure can add more.
I wonder if I might, because we've only got a few minutes left, and I definitely want to get to this lady's question about women, and I will certainly come back, I think, for our last question to talk about linking these different systems together to make sure that people don't fall back to a situation as worse as they were before. But I wonder, when we're speaking about women receiving cash, we have quite a lot of evidence from our research that one, it can cause conflicts in households sometimes, or that many women say, men are left out because it's the women that are receiving the cash. The obvious reason why we do that is because women are more likely to spend the money on the children or on food for the household. But specifically about this question of breadth versus depth, and how often and how much and when, I think we see quite different preferences between men and women. Women, for example, are more likely to say that they would like to receive money regularly, but in smaller parcels. And I think in qualitative research, we found that that's mainly because if money comes in as one lump sum, it's more likely to be part of it taken by the husband to spend on other things. And this giving money at more regular intervals in smaller amounts allows women a bit more ability to plan with what they're doing. That's obviously, a very narrow focus based on what Ground Truth Solutions has looked at. I wonder, maybe Francesca De Celia, what do you think about this? And I mean, if you could say maybe a few sentences about how women are targeted with the potential issues that come up there, and dealing with preferences from women that might be quite different to those from men.
Sure. Yes, Hannah, I will reply to this, and if possible, give a few other comments on the others before closing, because I will be kicked out of a meeting room soon. So absolutely, we see similarly to what you said. The preferences are different. Again, women are also not a monolith. Depending on, you're asking the young women, the elderly women, or the men of different groups. So what we've seen, I mean, we again are taking a stance on prioritizing women as the main recipient of the cash transfer for the household. Not about targeting only women. It's about doing what we've always done also with food, where the food ration was often promoted in the name of the women. And of course, with cash, this became much more sensitive because of the control of finances in the house, often led by the head of household that we know is mostly the men. So we want to really try to change this. And the way we've been doing it so far in very even patriarchal societies, honestly, was, of course, engaging the men and community leaders since the start. So male champions have been actually our best ally to say, that why should the account that we're going to open, or that we are providing on a mobile money account, is in the name of women. And whether this was in DRC, in Uganda, in Jordan, and many other countries, it has proven a long process for sure. It's not something you do one day to the other if they are currently being the main recipient for the family. But it is totally possible, again, with constant community engagement, and particularly working with local associations, representatives of the refugees in the camps or outside the camps, and really building this work together. Of course, with our gender colleagues, we look at all the risks and the gender analysis required. Again, protection concerns are, of course, super critical, but we also have to debunk a bit the myths that this will automatically generate more violence or more problems, because actually a lot of the evidence is not saying that right now. It's actually often reducing the tension if this tension was related to financial stresses as well. So we have a whole work stream on this. We're very happy to discuss also bilaterally or do follow-ups on this topic, particularly for prioritizing women as main recipients and supporting their financial inclusion. And again, doing that not just because they are those that spend on the family, but also or because they're the caretakers, but because they're very smart investors and actually are agents of change in their communities. And again, bringing men in since the start is really key. I just wanted to say again, this also we do when we work with governments. So I know we've been discussing a lot. WFP supports last year, I think 65 governments in their cash programs in designing, delivering. And oftentimes we complement their program so that we indeed can have more globally or in general, in total, more coverage or adequacy of the transfers. And I think that responding also, sorry, to someone from the public from the US, that it's a very good question actually from before the programs. So in emergency settings, particularly when it's a sudden onset or very large scale displacement, let's take last year in Moldova with the refugees coming from Ukraine. I mean, of course, the knee-jerk reaction in this first few moments when you set up, even in a country where we weren't operating a cash transfer program, is we need to deliver. We need to find all the ways to deliver. So oftentimes the community engagement comes last. It wasn't the case in that. I think actually there's also some colleagues online who have been really pushing to go out there and speak to people, particularly the host families of Ukrainian refugees, as well as the refugees themselves, in terms of what would be the best approach. And this is not done, and this is answering to someone else, it's not that user journeys and all this engagement with communities done, it's either or compared to the strategic planning and engagement with governments and many other stakeholders. It's a combination of, we have put too much emphasis in the past in the capital level type of discussions and not going really out there in community engagement, and we need to do better at both, but they are combined for sure. So over from my end on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know we've already gone over time by a couple of minutes, but I wonder if each panelist could maybe say one word, one key takeaway from this. We didn't have time to get into how to better coordinate all of this between government, between donors, humanitarians. So if you would like to address that in your one sentence, please feel free. And to everybody online, we will also have a look at the questions you posted in the chat and address those afterwards. So we'll be reaching out. But a final word from each of our panelists before we say thank you and goodbye. Maybe starting with you, Andres.
Definitely more to learn and understand about preferences and the way that this impacts people in the short and the long term. And it is possible to implement these preferences. We have done it, and we believe we have the technology to do it at a larger scale. So it's not the implementation, but it is the decision to actually do it. That's the binding constraint.
Great, thank you. Liam?
I think it's great that we have the reflex to ask ourselves this question about letting people decide, but I think it's also important we apply the same lens to societies, to contexts that we're working, and try to figure out who are the decision makers, try to understand that stratification of preferences, and that program design should be adapted to the circumstances of individual groups within a particular society.
Wonderful. And then finally, Francesca from Somali Cash Consortium, a final sentence from you.
Thanks. Maybe just, Hannah, to pick on what you just mentioned, which, as you said, we weren't able to cover the coordination of these key actors. But I think what was done in Somalia over the past year with the shock responsive safety net really enabled to link actors with very different mandates. So the development donors that funds the long-term programs, the humanitarian donor that was able to fund the shock response, and most importantly, the government whose political will to do this means that for the future of Somalia, such approaches will be used to really enable gains from longer term programs not to be lost every time there is a shock hitting. So maybe just to close on that, because for us was an extremely important lesson learned and really showing that it is possible. So the Nexus is not just a fancy word, but we can put it in practice for the benefits of the communities we serve. Thanks. Sorry, more than one word.
No, it's fine, and I love ending on the Nexus isn't just a fancy word. So I think on that we'll leave it there, and I just want to thank you very much to all the panelists and for all of your preparation for this. Thanks to everybody that joined online and for everybody here in person. Yeah, looking forward to chatting more over coffee about this later.
Thank you. Bye. Have some coffee for us.
Bye bye. Grazie.